9 islands of lush, otherworldly landscape in the North Atlantic, each one more Jurassic, uncanny, familiar, volcanic than the next. Portugal's first foray into colonialism, a stepping stone and a crossroads for the globalised world we live in today. 1,500 kilometres out from the European mainland, and not much further to the eastern coast of North America. The history goes that these islands were first discovered in 1427 by the Portuguese. If so, why do maps from a century before show what looks like the Azores on them? In the last few years, new research has provided evidence for there being human habitation up to 700 years before currently thought possible, all the way back to 750 AD. And some on the islands claim humans were here thousands of years before even that. And I suppose the question is, by who? I'm here for exactly 1 week to try and find out what landscapes greeted them, what was their legacy, and walking around in their footsteps well over 1,000 years later, what will touch me? How have these 9 islands, the Azores, shaped human history? Earlier this year, I walked 560 miles along the Camino Frances from Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port through Santiago de Compostela and onto Finisterre, or Finisterre, the end of the earth in Latin, on the western coast of Galicia. The awesome power of the rich blue waves of the Atlantic underneath the lighthouse at the Cape, at the end of the world, captivated me. Well, briefly, being brought crashing back down to the mortal realm when dozens of German pensioners turned up in 2 coaches. But standing at the end of the earth, looking out to the Atlantic, it got me to thinking about the islands that marked the final stop, or first port of call for sailors crossing the Atlantic. About 1,500 kilometres out to where I was looking, the islands of the Azores have always been one of those destinations I wonder. Now just what goes on there? So when, on a random Friday night just before my 28th birthday, I find return flights for 50 quid from Ryanair, compared to the usual 300 quid, I felt it was meant to be. And yes, the outbound flights for the following Tuesday, I've not done nearly enough reading. My luggage assigned to me only fits under the seat. I'm woefully underprepared. But that's what I like to think of as the fun zone. A week is a long time, but nowhere near long enough for this. I find it crazy to think how for thousands of years, people have looked at the skies and dreamt about flying. And now it's so normalised. Hardly anybody even looks out the window at the landscape below anymore. I do though. Stare out that window like the God-fearing peasant you are. I can raw dog a flight, sitting arrogantly because despite refusing to pay an extra single penny to the cost of my flight for a seat, my random seat allocation is in the emergency exit with blessed legroom. When we land, I'm immediately hit with the unpredictability of the Azores. My onward flight to Pico Island for this afternoon has been rescheduled until tomorrow night. I see on the front page of the local newspaper that the local airline is in complete disarray. Only 2 of the 7 planes are working, and I'm almost impressed how that's even fucking possible. I only have a week booked, so my best laid plans are in chaos. A flight for the following evening essentially means a waste of 2 days, scuppering my admittedly tight schedule. Unfortunately, that means I can't go to the furthest western island of Flores. I simply don't have the time. I'll hire a car instead, get some hiking done here on San Miguel. On my 3-mile walk into Ponta Delgada, to avoid paying a €10 taxi, I'm thinking that this is obviously a much more urban entrance to the island than visitors in the past. But even when you peel away the attractive Portuguese architecture, you can tell this island is very interesting. I drop into the Cum Bar for a pint. After a sweaty walk, Club União Michelense are a football team in the 5th tier of Portuguese football, based here in the city. This is their bar. Speaking to the passionate locals, I get the impression they would say, "Cut me, I bleed cum." Got me feeling like I'm making the same joke they've heard 100 times, but I don't care. It feels great to make it. Who would take that away from me? In archaeological terms, the past few years on the Azores have been incredibly exciting, or at least as exciting as it can be. Convincing evidence has been presented in 2 papers to move the date of human occupation on some of these remote islands back 700 years. Mice are not native to the Azores. The common house mouse had to have been introduced to the islands from human visitors, tagging along for the ride in the depths of wooden ships. A 2015 paper found that on 3 out of the 9 islands, the DNA of the common house mouse found did not have the expected Portuguese heritage. Instead, they discovered that these mice had a northern European source area similar to that found in regions where the Norse or Vikings raided and settled. Just a quick side note, the term Viking is actually the Old Norse word for pirate or raider. It's a job title and not an ethnic group. Where possible, I will use the term Norse from here on out. A 2021 paper took a number of approaches, using sediment samples taken deep from lake beds on the islands. Evidence for human occupation was found much further down in the layers than historically accepted. Examples of these markers included higher than natural incidences of charcoal and a reduction in tree pollen, evidence of burning down forests for agriculture, chemical compounds and fungus only found in the feces of livestock, which again aren't native to the island, all in sedimentary layers well below the layer that would date to the Portuguese arrival in 1427. And when the Portuguese arrived, they said that these islands were uninhabited and pristine. There's obviously a degree of error and guesswork involved in these predictions, but the authors of the 2021 paper estimated that the arrival of the Norse was likely to have been around 750 to 850 AD. And there were at least 400 years of these human markers, culminating in evidence for farming. And along with the researchers who did DNA testing on the mice, the authors of the 2021 paper concluded that it was most likely the Norse who are responsible for this evidence. They were active along trade routes in both the North Atlantic and the Mediterranean around this time. I mean, hell, their cousins in the east would go on to trade extensively with the Eastern Roman Empire, Persia, along the waterways of Russia. So to these dates of about 700 to 850 AD, where it's estimated that the Norse first visited the Azores. And of course there's a margin of error. But anyway, around this time, the pagan Norse were raiding along the coast of Northern Europe and the British Isles. Iceland may have been colonised by then. They would later set their sights on Greenland, and even set up a short-lived base on the eastern coast of North America at Lanso Meadows in Newfoundland. During the medieval period, the weather in the northern hemisphere was much warmer, and the currents of the Atlantic Ocean, which are usually characterised by their strong westerly direction today, blew in different directions. The authors of the 2021 paper say predominantly northeasterly. Atmospheric patterns at the time had flipped to what we are familiar with today, because of the centuries of warmer weather in the north. I don't know exactly how, I'm not a climatologist. It was around the 14th century when the Little Ice Age began, when these climate patterns shifted back to the prevailing winds and currents we know today. You might be thinking, why is this man waffling about weather? But obviously the direction of the winds affected massively where small wooden ships of the era could sail. By enjoying the flipped, predominantly northeasterly winds, the Norse could easily explore the seas around their lands. And more importantly for this video, it would mean that if they were blown off course, discovering the Azores would have been much more likely due to the currents. They would have essentially shepherded the boats into the relative safety of the islands with its blessed fresh water and food. It's genuinely quite scary how extreme these climate changes were, when you're talking about temperatures a fraction of a Celsius warmer than average for a few centuries. The Little Ice Age, where the Thames froze over many times, I couldn't find any high resolution images of it. Look at the state of these. Continued into the 1800s. We reached 1 Celsius in 2017 and we'll reach 1.5 Celsius by 2040. The effects on the climate in the next 100-200 years are unfathomable. So I've already answered the question at the start. It was most likely the Norse who arrived here. But why wasn't there any trace of them when the Portuguese arrived in 1427? But there might be a political answer to this question. When the Portuguese arrived, it was during the early days of the age of exploration and colonialism. If the Portuguese did find evidence for previous human occupation here, in the form of small homesteads or farming, it would be imperative for the Portuguese to make sure that their claim on the island was completely exclusive. So maybe they lied. That being said, the only evidence for the Norse existence on these islands is in the form of these lake beds and the mice. The mice in that case being a living artifact of the past, but there hasn't been any physical, material remains that we normally deal with in archaeology. But that doesn't mean I still can't imagine what it was like for them arriving in these strange lands, walking among the alien landscape. And this week I will be an alien too, experiencing it all for the first time, just like them. What on earth did they think about the Azores? What on earth do I think about the Azores? Some of you might be thinking, why should I care? Well, for me, I think there's something far beyond science or ensuring the historical record is accurate at play here for me. In a world where every surface of the Earth is mapped, Elon's satellites rattling hundreds of miles up above beaming 5G directly into your nan's brain. Don't forget to warn her over WhatsApp. Tales of exploration, being blown off course to unfamiliar shores, of reimagining existing landscapes, stories and myths. Like this, tap into something deeper inside of me. A place to imagine tiny longships being dwarfed amidst the endless expanse of ocean, burning forests for livestock, 700 years later no trace. Medieval maps showing phantom islands in the Atlantic, mythical lands of beasts and magic. I get transported in my imagination back to the age of exploration. There have even been dubious claims for megalithic architecture on these islands, dating to thousands of years before any of this that I'm talking about. I'll go into that in more detail later. But I think my point is that whatever the exact truth is, it's whatever. For me, it's not about that. I just want to tap into this simple sense of wonder and mystery exploration. As if something shattering is about to be revealed with every mile I walk on a hike. Almost like watching Lost for the first time. And of course, nothing will be revealed. But if it feels like it might, then that is all that matters to me. There's no way I can explore all of these islands in just 1 week. So for the week I do have, I am a Norse. I am an alien. I often think about this Vonnegut quote whenever I start to care too much about things. We have been put on this earth to fart about. We are benevolent aliens. So I'll be walking around like Vonnegut in the alien landscape of these islands, positioned along the junction of 3 continental plates, volcanoes, thousands of kilometers away from any landmass. I cannot wait. Each of the islands of the Azores is volcanic. If measured from their base at the bottom of the ocean to their peaks, the Azores are among the tallest mountains on the planet. And I've always said, always measure from the base. The 3 continental plates that intersect here are very slowly pulling away from each other. There are thousands of earthquakes here every year. It's just that most of them are undetectable. In fact, on the island of São Jorge, in the last 2 years, there have been thousands of small tremors deep below, with 20 million cubic meters of magma intruding under the surface. Basically, it seemed likely it was time for an eruption again, but then it just didn't. Bit boring. I wonder if I'll feel any earthquakes. There have been 28 recorded eruptions on the islands since the 15th century. I'm in the town of Furnas, on the island of São Miguel. I am situated within a gigantic caldera, essentially a crater where the volcano previously blew its top. Manifestations on the surface of magma seeping up from the bowels below scar the landscape, heating spring water, creating boiling, putrid pools of sulphury, mineral-rich ooze. Locals use the pools to cook sweet corn plucked from the deep sewage of the earth. Chef husband in the van, dropping them off to his wife on the stand. Doesn't even taste of farts. Frankly, they're perfectly cooked, delicious. But all I can think about, what cheap overheads. This is the most volcanically active site on the island. The taps which dot the town supply spa water, which is surprisingly fizzy and metallic to the taste. Almost salty. Definitely a tonic, rather than a thirst quencher. It's reminding me of a Blind Boy podcast episode where he discusses why the Irish drank so much soda water, the new invention, in 19th century New York. They thought, as the factory-produced soda was carbonated, fizzy, that it possessed remedial medicinal qualities. This was because, as Irish folk tradition passed down through centuries went, certain naturally carbonated springs in Ireland were known and proven to heal people. One spring mentioned in particular was said to cure depression, and recently, in 2012 I think, it was found that the spring contained lithium, which is now prescribed for the very same by doctors. I'm not sure what my point is, but I think that this water tastes good for my brain. The room temperature taps anyway. On my way back to my car, a man darts past me going, "Ah!" rubbing his hand in pain. As he disappears into the crowd, I spot the sign for the fountain next to me, 96.2 Celsius. Can't help but laugh. In order to get to the small fishing town of Ribeira Quente, I have to cut through the tunnel, through the walls of the caldera crater. The weather is refusing to clear. So I sit in my Vauxhall Astra in the car park. having my second bifana of the trip so far. A pork fillet roll. This one has a very tomatoey ketchup, almost like a relish. The lady from the catering van put on lots of onions and Tabasco. Not bad for a couple of quid. I've decided to drive the entire circumference of São Miguel today, and as I am stuck behind a tractor for the 4th time so far, all I can think about is that this island is like an uncanny valley, British Isles. As if it's the first 50 years of fucking, I don't know, Dorset being teleported to the tropics. It manages to capture all energies at once like I've never seen before. At times, when I'm strolling through the tiered tea plantations, which is the only location in Europe to grow it, I feel like I'm back in Southeast Asia. Lush, humid weather, extravagant plants, the volcanoes, it's so unfamiliar. But it also feels so homely. There's rolling, sometimes stark, green hills, gargantuan stones, fog, and that's familiar. Staring out to the ocean in the direction of Finisterre, Galicia, where I got the idea of visiting a couple of months ago, and I'm thinking the Norse may well have had the same geological confusion I'm feeling right now. In any case, they were certainly familiar with at least one half of the islands, the familiar half, the one that I recognise. One half of this lake is called Lake Azul, and one is Lake Verde. Blue, green. Verde, I think, because of the build-up of organic material against the fringes, which frankly resembles the filling of a baklava. In trying to show off, this kid almost certainly fucked his bike, if the pathetic sounds of it in the distance is anything to go by. It's the following day, and I'm on a hike to the Janela do Inferno. Does that translate to what I think it does? Yeah, that's right. Window of Hell. Hell's window. An hour of pleasant strolling. Pleasant views. Vince Staples' new album in my ears. What can I say? Just bloody pleasant. In order to reach the final stage of the trail, you have to traverse a subterranean passage to enter the Window of Hell with its stunning views and American tourists. You have to cross the threshold, cross the Styx. It's all very poetic. The moment I emerge on the other side to a lush jungle landscape, I'm thinking, honestly, they were cooking when they named this. The kind of environment which makes me want to start an online rumour that there were megalithic giants here thousands of years ago, just for a laugh. Every fragment of man here, likely tedious pieces of old infrastructure, feel like artefacts from a long lost civilization. Feels like they were here before the Norse, before modern man, dilapidated, overgrown, mossy stone temples to a long forgotten god. I have to say that every inch of this island feels like it's in a battle with nature to reclaim it. Like, what's this symbol carved into the rock next to some plumbing? The whole walk feels otherworldly, and I'm saying that word a lot at the moment, to be honest. An island at the juncture of 3 continental plates, the fissures and vents from the depths of the earth snaking its way upwards. I almost feel it's not just magma and energy being released to the surface here through the volcanic vents, that there are also unknowable forces being sent up to the landscape, a thin space where different worlds blend into each other. Why else does everything feel so unique here? Just because we live in a rationalised world where we can explain phenomena away doesn't mean the previous visitors to this island felt the same. Coming here with their Norse, pagan, spiritual worldview, it would be hard to imagine them feeling anything different to how I do right now. I feel like different volcanic islands have different energies. Iceland's is obviously white, Japan is like, I don't know, blue, São Miguel, green. Absolutely every shade of it, with the feeling that if I drink from this special spring emanating from the cave, the Window of Hell, I'll be fucking teleported into a ring of daisies somewhere in the west of Ireland, a Celtic druid approaching me with open arms. In the 1990s, a local archaeologist wrote a paper with claims for a megalithic ancient culture on the islands. This has been followed up a couple of times in more recent years without any concrete scientific proof as of yet. The evidence put forward is a host of supposedly man-made stone structures, dolmens and chambers. It seems that so far, the scientific consensus is that all were either formed naturally by magma flows or built more recently. Claims like these really capture the imagination. Neolithic or Bronze Age man sailing thousands of kilometres in the open ocean from the European shore. Sometimes, Claims like these tend towards the ancient alien conspiracy content which is harvested for views, clicks and ads by companies and charlatans. But if you go to the extreme fringe of Southeast Asia, around the time in question what we're talking about, humans had already accomplished this, setting out into the China Sea and the Pacific on canoes. What can I say? An ancient civilization on the Azores really captures the imagination. It's just a shame there isn't any solid evidence to back it up yet. But anyway, here's to the ingenuity of our historical selves. They had the same brains and were no doubtedly more talented than us. It's 7:30 AM and I'm on a medium-sized de Havilland propellered plane to the island of Fayal in the central group of the Azores. It's a mild, misty morning, quiet, serene. I go up to the cafe on the roof of the airport. There's a poster on the wall with the story of a pilot or a commander who came in and asked for a personalised sandwich. And all I can think is, I don't know man, kinda sounds like shit. This little cake is better. It's like a gelatinous carrot cake, very squidgy. It's got that Q texture. The airport's a little bit outside of the port town of Horta where I'm going. So I hop in a taxi. In the history of the Azores, Horta has probably been the most influential place. Every ship, huge flows of wealth pass through here, and now it is the hub for sailors braving the North Atlantic crossing. I have a walk around the harbour and then get a quick coffee and breakfast. I meet an English couple who live here during the summer. They can't recommend a local fish restaurant for me. They don't eat out in town. I ask if they're sailors. No, the wife is scared of water. They just like the place. Important not to box people. You can walk the town in 30 minutes, and it's definitely not as lively or organic as Ponta Delgado found, even with the car crash. But the idea of this town and island being a sort of free economic zone for its history has never truly gone away. It's very international, and it's not just tourists. When Mark Twain visited Horta en route to Europe, which is documented in his book The Innocents Abroad, he was quite brutal in his description of the locals. The community is eminently Portuguese. That is to say, it is slow, poor, shiftless, sleepy and lazy. There is not a modern plough in the islands or a threshing machine. All attempts to introduce them have failed. The good Catholic Portuguese crossed himself and prayed God to shield him from all blasphemous desire to know more than his father did before him. The donkeys and the men, women and children of a family all eat and sleep in the same room and are unclean, ravaged by vermin, and are truly happy. In another passage of the book, he complains because the locals try to charge the ferry passengers over the going rate for a lift into town. God forbid they try and charge some rich Americans a little bit over a usual rate for a ride, right? But actually, tariffs and charges on boats passing through funded a bourgeois upper class in the town. There are stunning townhouses, churches and restaurants which were all funded by those revenues. After a walk around town, I head into the museum. I feel that Horta perfectly represents the globalized age of exploration and capitalism. It was the bridge between Europe and the New World for Europeans. In a slightly alien landscape, scenes of slavery, of tremendous riches and wealth played out. In the early centuries of Portuguese control, the islands relied heavily on imported African labour to work on the sugar plantations that they set up here. The industry declined in the 17th century due to competition from larger plantations, now flourishing in Brazil. But these islands were the blueprint for it. It was almost like a laboratory which could be exported to the larger continent to the southwest. The Azores were the stepping stone to the exploitation of colonialism, which has obviously shaped our world today. Horta also played a role in revolutionising global communication. Undersea telegraph cables across the Atlantic were laid here in the 19th century. 2 weeks to 2 minutes was the tagline for one of the companies involved. In fact, one of the stories Mark Twain recounts is his interaction with a local Portuguese man who fancied himself as a well-read, travelled man. News would come to the islands monthly from the cargo ships. The Portuguese man expressed surprise at the fact Twain was in possession of a piece of European news that he had not read yet. Twain had just travelled from New York. How on earth could he have heard of it? Well, it turns out that Twain travelled shortly after the first telegraph had been laid across the Atlantic, meaning newspapers in New York could print relatively up-to-date European news, as opposed to the Azorean man who had to wait for his newspapers or monthly periodicals to get shipped across. Due to its location, the first transatlantic flight passed through here as well. Next to the port, there's a famous bar frequented by sailors either embarking on all coming back from crossing the Atlantic. Peter's Cafe is a sort of museum in of itself, with its artifacts and memoriams of previous visitors, going back decades. The food is decent too. I get the Azorean starters, apparently. Yam, pineapple, chorizo sausage, and blood sausage, black pudding, and a pint of superbog. It feels fitting that among the uncanny landscape of the Azores, an uncanny modern world was building around it, both here and on the globe. Communications, long-distance trade, industrialization. I saunter over to the working poor after my big lunch. I see what I think is just a giant tuna frozen absolutely rock solid, being loaded into a container. The forklift driver gives me a nod and a thumbs up. He's certified. I nod, head bowed with respect. Another massive industry in the history of this island was whaling. At the museum, in an old factory, it's genuinely gutting seeing the film of the industrial slaughter of such a giant creature, pardon the pun. Dozens of men enthusiastically chopping away at its flesh in the factory to be burned for oil or ground for animal feed. Believe it or not, whale oil was the primary source of fuel for lamps in the age before electricity, and was also used as lubrication in industrial machinery. Whaling ships from America, embarking on 2 or 3 year trips at a time, would stop in the Azores first regularly. All I can think is, God, I need to finally get round to reading Moby Dick. There were quite a few old, abandoned homes and villas on the island. A lot of islands had higher populations during the Victorian period than they do now. More than half of the population of the Azores emigrated for better prospects. In fact, before the modern era, a lot of the inhabitants worked for very little money for landowners from the mainland. In a lot of ways, these islands were treated as yet another Portuguese colonial project. Working class Portuguese servants made to work on the farms, slaves from Africa to work on the sugar, as I've mentioned, Flemish weavers even, and therefore many people on the islands decided to emigrate for better prospects. Many went to America or Portugal. The local whalers went to America for more money. They even set up a local Azorean neighborhood in the whaling capital of New Bedford, Massachusetts, on the east coast of America. From one Azorean hood to another, this was known as capote e capello in Portuguese. It was a traditional garment worn by women up until the 1930s. It was thought to be influenced by Flemish immigrants and the religious conservative society at the time. I frankly love it. The old pictures are so cool. It's straight out of a folk horror film. The whaling industry finally declined in the Azores in the middle of the 20th century and stopped completely in 1986. And now they conserve the local whales. You can hire a tour on just about any of the islands to see them off the coasts. Do you know they can dive for up to an hour? I go back to Peter's Cafe in the evening for some drinks, and honestly, I find this transatlantic yachting culture a little bit odd. It's obviously middle class, but some of the sailors on these ships, they're like the meth middle class, unkempt, socialising at the bar like it's an episode of Below Deck. I spoke to a German guy a few years younger than me earlier. He said that the rudder on the boat he was working on had broken halfway through the crossing. They had to fashion a makeshift replacement, and eventually the North Atlantic currents shepherded them to Flores in the far west of the islands. They were so close to abandoning ship and getting picked up by cargo, but saw it through. All I can think about is how they enjoy all the perks of a high-tech globalized world, throwing up a Mayday signal with full satellite navigation to be picked up safely post-haste. My Norse friends didn't have that luxury. No tinned food or onboard water distillation. The difference between my German friend ending up at Flores after deciding the boat is a little bit too important to ditch just yet, and the Norse who were blown off course over 1,000 miles from their usual trade routes along the western coast of Iberia. They're opposite sides of the same coin, I guess. Over my last drink, I meet 2 Portuguese women who work on the island, and one works in finance. Of course, there are finance firms here. It's hard to ignore Mount Pico on the island across the channel. It's a 2,500 metre high volcano which towers over the entire landscape in its presence, even with the frequent cloud cover that slinks in from the ocean. It's technically the highest point in all of Portugal. And it's interesting to think this one has never blown its top over history, as opposed to the calderas I went on about on San Miguel. It's almost a proto-crater. It's just another link to the Jurassic. It all just fits. Am I chatting shit? Almost certainly, but it makes sense to me. Let me have fun. Next day, and I'm on a ferry across the channel to the fabled Pico Island. It's known for its black volcanic soil, rich and fertile. The island is famous for wine, especially the Verdelho grape, which is a white, and apparently salty. And like I said, the highest mountain in Portugal, and it's a dormant volcano. Pico is known as Ilha Preta, I don't know why I did an Italian accent, which means Black Island. Straight into O Petisca for some lunch though. It's a good sign that I have to wait for about half an hour outside for a table. 3 of your most interesting critters please, my good man. And do you have that local salty white wine? I have my first ever barnacles that I dig out of its shell, as well as some chicken gizzards and some stewed octopus. It's all delicious, and the local wine, it is very dry and strong, but it goes down ridiculously smoothly. Time for a long walk. Everything on Pico is either white, black or green. It's so cool. Swathes of the island are UNESCO protected as heritage. Distinctive black volcanic rocks and soil, and the vineyards themselves are actually demarcated by the black rock as walls. I feel like if this volcano goes, everybody is so dead. I'm planning the escape route in my head for when I start hearing some rumblings, straight into the ocean. Pico was the last of the islands to be occupied. Apparently, because of the nature of the soil, rocks, normal crops like wheat couldn't be farmed as easily. A sort of specialization of economy was required in order to make the land economically viable, especially because of the lack of any rivers on the island. So wine and lots of trade with the more populated and green island of Faial across the bay eventually ensured growth. There were windmills on Pico, tracks of ox carts around the vineyards that have been there for centuries. Hundreds of years of cultivation. And yeah, it doesn't look as if anything would be possible to grow in this rocky landscape, Martian landscape, but it's actually very fertile if you choose the right crops. And apparently, these grapes are really hardy. Although wine tasting was unfortunately going to take me into the out of budget territory. Also, I've never done it before. I think I'd be out of my depth. I'm much more of a guzzler. Just a hike along the coast through the vineyards for me then. Can't charge for that. I stop into a beach bar, if you can call this a beach, for hydration. They have Somersby cider on tap. This must be some of the most boring trivia I possess, which is saying something, but in Europe, some mass market ciders have different recipes to cider that I'm used to in the UK. It's actually just carbonated water, apple juice from concentrate, and rice wine. Like a slightly boozy appetizer, or tango apple. Honestly, it's hitting the spot right now. I think I'm incredibly dehydrated. The local lizards camouflage themselves perfectly with the lava rock walls. Some drunk locals are jovially shouting at me in Portuguese. At least, I think it's jovial. I don't speak the language. Quick, shake his hand. All good. They offer me a lift back to Madalena town. I slap my gut and say I need the exercise. They laugh and understand, beep their horn as they drive past. I feel like with Pico's volcanic islands, nutrients and minerals, this place is crying out to be grifted. Forget just selling wine, start selling mineral healing soap. Invite Gwyneth Paltrow. I just feel it would be so easy to dupe some posh white girls if you waffled about the minerals from the depths of the earth, fertility of the soil, and the soap for the clean girl look. Get in touch if you're interested, I know I'm onto a banker. To be honest, I found that on all of the Azores, yeah, of course they're tourists, but in terms of grifts and ugly tourist hat over-tourism, it's not too bad at all, at least in June time. The tourists that I've met tend to be the more hikey types or older. I can imagine this changing in the future, but for now it feels a little bit more authentic than a lot of places in Europe I've been to. I get the final ferry back to Faial just past 9 PM. The kids in football kit I saw on the first ferry are going home. The sunset is beautiful. This rocky stack was actually formed by a volcano. It's the last remnants of a caldera that had sunk into the ocean. After my long, sunny, boozy day, I know how it feels. Time for sleep. It's my final day on Faial, and I'm enjoying my morning coffee and treat in the bay where they used to drag the whales to and butcher. On reflection, the comparison between Faial and Pico, despite being separated by only a 4-mile channel, is indescribable. Faial has rolling green fields, innumerable flowers, hedges, terracotta-topped stone houses. They may as well be on different planets. I make it to the airport. My boots are a bit smelly. Strap them up instead. And oh, for fuck's sake, my wired headphones are on the blink. glitching in and out of fidelity. Third time's the charm, I think, as I fail to find the right angle in the slot yet again. I'm back in Ponta Delgada for my last full day on the island, and I'm off to a pineapple farm. Now, the pineapple is native to South America, and Columbus came across them while in the Caribbean in 1493. Over the next couple of centuries, the pineapple became a high status good in wealthy palaces and houses across Europe. And from the 18th century, botanists in Northern Europe had figured out a way to grow pineapples in hothouses, a sort of predecessor to the greenhouse. And pineapples are grown on the Azores in greenhouses. They are smoked around 4 months to trigger flowering. And did you know that a pineapple is actually just a load of berries fused together, like some sort of delicious rat king of the fruit variety? Quite a varied, silly basket of goods they have here. Pineapple, tea, wine, cheese, fish. Well, São Miguel is the Ilha de Verde, or Green Island after all. I'm currently reading Islands of Abandonment, a book on the ecology and psychology of abandoned places, how quickly nature colonizes and reclaims after humans have left. There was apparently no trace of the Norse, except for the mice, who in the absence of any larger mammals were very successful, proliferating rapidly. I wonder how quickly nature would utterly cover these islands in the absence of people yet again. I think it would do a pretty good job, but these days the idea that there wouldn't be a trace is unthinkable. We always leave an indelible ecological mark. There are microplastics in my blood and within deep sea ice in the Antarctic. But it doesn't mean we can't make moves to rehabilitate by literally just leaving areas alone. Even the area around Chernobyl, as Cal Flynn says, returned with golden grass and tree cover. I've decided I might never get a better chance to see a sperm whale in the flesh. So I have hopped on a boat, ran by an old fisherman, to hopefully go and spot them. It's crazy to think, as I look out to the south, if I went in a straight line, the next land would genuinely be Antarctica. We're followed by dolphins as we tootle out 15 miles or so from port. The captain says that as this is an old fishing vessel, an old wooden boat, the engine noises are well insulated and less harmful compared to the more modern speedboats we see on the water as well. And consequently, the dolphins come a lot closer and even ride the waves emanating from the wake of our ship. This allays my fears somewhat, as I was starting to get an uncomfortable feeling that this is incredibly disruptive. But the dolphins, they seem to be having a lot of fun. The crew on the ship are the captain's sons, including the spotters. After nearly 3 hours, it's starting to seem unlikely we will see any waves, until a shout is made from up above and we speed over, just in time for a sperm whale mother and calf to surface for air before diving back down. They won't be seen for at least another 30 minutes. My camera dies at the worst possible moment, but I managed to catch the tail plunging beneath the surface on my phone. And when it comes to the whales, the boat keeps a large distance. As we're heading back to shore, the captain invites the passengers inside the cabin for a talk. He goes over the different types of dolphins we've seen today,
1, 2, 3, okay?
before randomly bursting into a tirade on how all of the other tour companies pay commission to the local hotels, and he would never do that.
More percentage, and that, they're doing that, okay?
At least 3 people are visibly being sick inside the cabin. The engine's still at full power. It's a feast for the senses. Just imagining being in this teen's shoes, lamely spitting that rising acidic bile from my mouth. Will this man ever shut up? Why did they all decide to come inside to do this? Back to reality, and the captain's boasting about not minding coming back an hour late if it means more sightings on the ocean.
So when I got in, I just go back. I make sure you see everything right. You just care about the time.
The teen groans as the last dregs of his stomach limp out into the flimsy plastic bag. I'm loving the talk, counting my blessings I don't get seasick. I've zoned out again. What's he saying now?
30th May was his first communion. Okay?
Of course, his son married a Lithuanian woman who was a guest on the boat and they fell in love. And now he has a grandchild. Genuinely romantic, I think. I'm ready for home time, get back to shore, and drink 2 bottles of Pico wine, I reckon. The Norse visited here at least 700 years before the Portuguese. They burned forests to create pastures for livestock and introduced enough of them for there to be evidence deep in the lake beds. To what extent, we don't know. So far, no material traces have been found. It's not historically attested beyond some islands on a map in the general vicinity of the Azores in the late medieval ages. The Azores are lush and fertile. Was the human landscape completely subsumed by nature again after the Norse left? Or were the Portuguese lying when they said the islands were untouched when they arrived? because of the fear of competition. Either way, it's easy to imagine what a safe haven this must have felt like when they arrived. After thousands of miles of open ocean, presumably blown off course by the then northeasterly winds, or later visitors eventually making it to the land of myth. They didn't remain, but some of their mice did, and they enjoyed at least 3 of the islands to themselves for a long time. I think the otherworldly nature of these islands really suit the history. Like, of course, there were rumours, vague evidence of previous inhabitants, shrouded in myth, megalithic inhabitants before that even. And in the space of a century, the islands were colonised in quite a cosmopolitan fashion by the Portuguese. Every boat stopped here en route to or from the Americas. Such a tiny port like Horta would have seen innumerable riches, slaves, cruelty passing through it. Steampunk divers, undersea cables revolutionising the time messages could be sent from weeks to minutes. The brutal cruelty of whaling, hacking flesh and burning it for oil in lamps. And now, a growing tourist scene where people pay money to go out in boats to observe the dwindling population of marine mammals 15 miles offshore. Their habitat, feeding and breeding grounds diminishing due to warmer seas from climate change. This is weird, it's not normal, nothing feels normal. To the Norse, they would have felt oddly familiar in their green hills, rocks and cliffs, but also I feel completely the opposite. Black volcanic rocks, subtropical, unique flora. And I think this dichotomy remains, both in its landscape and its history today. It's just a bit bloody odd, and amazing to walk around like an alien, just farting about.